Hi everyone, and welcome to this week's Crime and Punishment story. This week I am covering the story of David Anderson, Anne Grimes and the murder of Ann Manson that took place in Newcastle Upon Tyne in 1880. But before we begin, can I just say, if you do enjoy this video, then please give it a thumbs up, and if you are new here or haven't already done so, then do please consider subscribing to the channel to help support the content we create. Thank you. And I would just like to also add, as I often do, that I do record these stories live, so do sometimes make mistakes, which I always try to rectify, so I hope this does not spoil your enjoyment of the video. And again, as this story is where a lot of the Christian names are the same, I will refer to some of them by surnames to try and stop any confusion. Although it is quite rare, this is one of those stories where there is very little information about the past lives of some of those involved, so their details are quite basic. David Anderson was said to be around 44 years old in 1880, so would have been born in around 1836. His place of birth is unknown, but he had been living in Newcastle with Ann Manson as husband and wife for several years. It was said that he worked as a labourer at the gasworks, and he was quite fond of a drink or two. Anne Grimes was born in around 1834 and was around 46 years old in 1880. She was living with David Anderson and Ann Mason in 1880, though no reason is given, as she did have at least one son living in Dog Bank at the time, and possibly a daughter living in Butcher's Bank. She was said to be a hawker, but no information is given as to what she sold. She was a widow and had possibly had 16 children in total, 7 of whom were still alive. She was a known drinker and had been in prison for around 16 times for minor offences. Her description suggests she had previously had a broken nose, and she had various other scars on her face, which made me believe she may have been in a few fights in her time. She was also described as being around 5'1" tall, with brown hair and brown eyes. And I have to add here that I have actually seen a photograph of Anne Grimes. Sadly, I cannot share it for copyright reasons, but to look at her, she does not look like a woman capable of attacking and killing anyone, but looks can be deceptive. Ann Manson, the victim, was 50 years old in 1880, so would have been born in around 1830. Little to nothing is known of her past life, other than the fact that she lived in Newcastle as the wife of David Anderson, although the couple were not actually married, and it was believed that she was a widow. On the night of October the 16th, 1880, Anne Grimes knocked on the door of Mrs. Fortune Anderson, no relation to David, who lived at Church Walk, Pilgrim Street in Newcastle, and she asked her to come into the home of Ann Manson and David Anderson. When she went in, she found Ann Manson was bleeding and appeared to have a large wound on her head. Although this was quite bad, Fortune simply bathed Manson's face and head and dressed the wound. However, she did tell her that she thought she needed to see a doctor. It was quite clear that all those in the room had been drinking. The following morning, David Anderson again called for Fortune, this time telling her to come quick, as he was sure that Ann Manson was dying. Fortune went straight to the house, and here she found 2 other women inside and Anne lying in bed. Her face was covered in blood, and it was clear that she was already dead and had been so for some hours. When asked what had happened, David said, "That woman who lives with us has done it," meaning Anne Grimes. He also said she had ran away and he did not know where she had gone. The police and doctor were called for, and Dr. Baumgartner arrived a short time later, and he could see 2 wounds to Anne's head, and he believed she had been dead for several hours. P.C. Elliot had been on duty in Pilgrim Street when he had heard about the incident, and on his arrival he found David Anderson standing in the middle of the room crying. He noticed blood in various places around the room, and he saw Anne's body was covered in blood and bruises, and he was quick to caution David Anderson, who told him he knew nothing about it, and he was then taken to the police station. There was no sign of a murder weapon inside the room. Anne Grimes was later found in Manor Street by PC Wessington. He told her she was wanted at the police station, and although he did not tell her what she was wanted for, she said, "I don't know anything about it, I was drunk." Later that day, both Anne Grimes and David Anderson were charged with the willful murder of Ann Manson. The inquest was held at the Pack Horse Inn on Pilgrim Street before Coroner Hoyle. However, full details of the inquest were quite difficult to find, so this is a combination of the inquest and the court hearing prior to the trial. And at the court hearing, both prisoners were allowed to question the witnesses. However, very little detail is given about what they asked. Ann White said she lived at 1 Church Walk and that she had identified the body as being that of Ann Manson, a widow, who also lived at Church Walk, Pilgrim Street. She said she believed she was around 50 years old, and she had always thought that she was married to David Anderson, as the couple lived together as husband and wife. Anne went on to say that David and Ann Manson often argued, usually when drink was involved, and she also said that Manson seemed to be a jealous person and arguments often seemed to be caused by this. Ann White then described the living arrangements of 1 Church Walk, saying it consisted of 2 downstairs rooms and 2 upstairs rooms. She lived with her husband in a downstairs room next to that of Anne and David, and 2 other families lived in the rooms above. She said around 7 p.m. on the night of October the 16th, she was passing the gates of All Saints Church when she met Ann Manson. She was carrying a can, and this no doubt would have been to collect drink from one of the nearby public houses. She said Manson had been drinking, but she did not think that she was drunk. Later that night, she said she had heard Manson singing at the foot of the stairs and sometimes swearing. She also heard someone talking to Fortune Anderson, who lived next door, but she could not be sure who it was. At 6 a.m. the next morning, she was awakened by Catherine Connaughton, who asked her to go to the home of Manson and David with her. She said once inside, she noticed David standing in the middle of the room and that he was crying. She said at first she thought Manson was only sleeping, but when she went towards the bed where she was lying, she noticed all of the blood, and on touching her she realized she was cold and her body was stiff. She said she asked David who had done this, and he said Ann Grimes. He told her Grimes had ran out of the house just before 6 a.m. that morning. She said she went outside and told a young boy to go for the police. She said David said to her, "This is a bad job," and she, on noticing David's shirt was covered in blood, told him to change it and get washed. He told her he had got blood on it because Manson had been lying on his chest during the night while they had been in bed. She went on to say that she had not lived in the house long, but she had heard the couple argue before. She thought perhaps when Manson had been talking about some other woman, but she did not know which woman, but Manson appeared to be very upset about her. It was at this point that Ann Grimes spoke to Ann White, telling her the woman Manson was upset about was the one who lived next door. John White, husband of Ann, said he had heard someone saying, "I am done, but I would drink it all." He did not know if it had been Manson, Grimes or David who had said this, but he knew they were all in the room drinking together at the time. He believed he had also heard 2 women arguing a little later, but he could not tell what they were saying. During the night he had heard someone outside of his room talking in hushed voices. He did not know who or what they said, and he did not hear anything else after this. Joseph Rule said he also lived at 1 Church Walk, Newcastle, and his room was above that of David and Manson. He said on the night in question he had gone to bed around 8 p.m. and had heard Grimes sleeping. I can only assume this to mean that he could hear her snoring, but it's not clear how he knew that it for certain that this was Grimes. He was awakened a short time later by a lot of noise from the room below. He believed the 2 women were shouting and swearing. He again went back to sleep, but was awakened later by more noise from the room below. He said he knew it was then 11 p.m. as he heard All Saints church clock strike the hour. This time he said he heard what sounded like someone falling. Then he heard a voice say, "There now, you have done it, let the woman alone." He heard no more after this. His wife, Eliza, said that she had heard sounds from the room below at about 3 a.m. She said these were mostly voices, but she could not hear how many or what they were saying. Catherine Connaughton said she also lived at One Church Walk, and that she said at 6 a.m. on Sunday morning, David Anderson came to her room shouting for her to wake up. She said he asked her to go to his room as he was worried about Manson. She said she knocked for Ann White on her way to the room. She asked David what was wrong, and she said he began to cry. She had noticed a lot of blood around the room, and she also realised that Manson was dead and had been so for some time. She then heard David tell Ann White that the person responsible was Anne Grimes, and he did not know where she had gone. Ellen Smith said she was married and lived in Church Walk, and on her way home on the night of the 16th she had passed the doorway to the home of David and Manson. She had seen Anne Grimes inside near the door to the room, and heard her say, "Take that, you called me names that I never was." She could not see who she was talking to, but she did sound quite angry. P.C. Elliott said he was on duty in Pilgrim Street on October the 16th when a young boy approached him and told him of a possible murder in Church Walk. On his arrival he found David standing in the middle of the room, and he did appear to be quite upset. He had examined the body of Ann Manson and noticed that she had 2 wounds to her head. Her arms and hands were also covered in blood, and she also had bruises on her arms and face. He said he had cautioned David, who had replied by saying, "Well, I know nothing about it. I came in drunk at 10 p.m. last night, and I knew no more till I woke at 6 a.m. this morning." P.C. Elliott went on to say that in the room near the window he found a dish with water, cloths, blood and hair in it. He said David told him that when he woke that morning Anne Grimes was washing something, and he had asked her, "Do you know of this job?" He then told P.C. Wessington that Grimes had not replied and had then ran out of the house. At this point, David Anderson asked P.C. Elliott if he had told him more people were in his home when he arrived drunk at 10 p.m. the night before, and P.C. Elliott replied that he had not. He had told him Ann Manson was alone when he arrived at 10 p.m. Fortune Anderson said she was a widow and lived in the house next to David and Manson in Church Walk. She said sometime between 9 and 10 p.m. on October the 16th, Grimes came to her to tell her that Manson wanted her. She found Manson with a large wound to her head. She noticed David was lying on the bed and Manson was sitting on the edge of it. She dressed the wound and told Manson she should really see a doctor. She said neither David nor Anne Grimes spoke to her while she was there. She believed David had been drinking, and also that the women seemed to be quite drunk. At this, Anne Grimes spoke to say that they had been drinking all day. Fortune continued by saying she had also gone into the room at 6 a.m. the following morning and had seen the 2 women, Ann White and Catherine Connaughton. She also looked at the body and realised Manson had been dead some time, as she was cold and stiff. Dr. Baumgartner said he had been called to the house on Sunday, October the 17th. He had examined the body of Ann Manson, and it was cold and stiff. He believed she had been dead several hours. She had 2 large wounds on her head, one reaching down to the bone, and it was possible that these had been caused by a poker or some similar object. He went on to say that he had performed the post-mortem on the Monday afternoon. All of the organs of her body were healthy, but they were bloodless. He said he believed the cause of death had been blood loss due to the wounds to her head, and the fact that she had been drunk at the time would have caused the blood loss to be greater. He also felt, had the wounds been properly dressed the night before, she may have survived. He stated that he had later examined Anne Grimes and found her to have 2 wounds to her head, but they were not serious. She had several patches of blood on her clothing and also hairs that seemed to match those of Ann Manson. P.C. Wessington said he had found Ann Grimes in Manor Street in Newcastle just before 8 a.m. on the Sunday morning. He told her she was wanted at the police station. He said she asked, "What am I being charged with?" and he said he told her she would be told at the station, and she replied to this by saying, "I don't know anything about it, I was drunk." The coroner then spoke to the jury at the inquest, stating that to him it was quite clear that this was not a case of murder. He felt it was one of manslaughter, and the jury at this very quickly returned a verdict of manslaughter against David Anderson and Ann Grimes, and they were committed for trial. I did not find any details of a funeral for Ann Manson, nor did I find any indication of a headstone for her anywhere in the area. I also did not find any mention of any family for her, so it is possible that she would have had a very simple funeral. The trial took place in Newcastle in late October of 1880. It is possible that it took place at the Guildhall, as this is mentioned in Anne Grimes' trial and court information. Both David Anderson and Anne Grimes pleaded not guilty to the charge. As a lot of the evidence at the trial was the same as that of the inquest, I will only include the new details. Burtis Gray said he was a labourer at the gasworks in Newcastle and had known David Anderson for 9 years. He said on the night of the 16th he had gone to his home in Church Walk, Pilgrim Street. He said only the 2 women were in the house at the time, and he said Grimes was very drunk and sat dozing by the fire. Manson was also drunk, but not quite as so much. He claimed that David Anderson returned at around 7:30 p.m, not the 10 p.m. he had mentioned in his statement. He said David had spoke to him to say he was no company for him that night as he was overdrunk, so Burtis said he left the house and went to his own home. When asked, he said he had always believed that Ann Manson was David's wife, and he had never seen him treat her unkindly, nor had he seen the couple argue, but he did know that Manson could be the jealous type. Superintendent Tunner said he had examined the house in Church Walk and had found several areas covered with blood, some of which he felt had been wiped as if someone was trying to clean up, and he believed the murder weapon to be something such as a poker. I must add here that a lower poker is mentioned as possibly being the murder weapon. No mention of one being found or examined is ever spoken of during the inquest or the trial, which did make me wonder if Anne Grimes had took it from the house and hid it somewhere, but if she did, she never discussed it. Neither Anne Grimes or David Anderson gave evidence on their own behalf. The defence then spoke, stating that while this was a case of much suspicion, he felt there was no clear evidence to suggest that David Anderson was guilty of any crime. The couple may have argued at times due to Manson's jealousy of other women, but no evidence was there to show that these arguments had ever been violent, and he felt that it should not be put to the jury to decide his fate. The judge, it seems, felt the same, stating that there had been no evidence that David had ever shown any signs of violence towards Ann Manson, and although he felt that David had not disclosed all he knew of that fateful night, he also felt there was no case to answer, and he then directed the jury to find the prisoner not guilty, which they duly did, and David Anderson was then free to leave. The case against Anne Grimes, however, still stood. The judge stated that she was a heavy drinker, and evidence seemed to suggest that she had got into a fight or an argument with Ann Manson that night. People had heard loud voices and angry voices coming from the room. It was said to be evident that Manson was jealous of Grimes, and Manson had been trying to throw Grimes out of her home, but she would not leave, and they had come to blows. The judge continued by saying no one had seen the blows, so perhaps Manson had struck first and Grimes had hit back in self-defence. However, there was no true evidence of this, so it would be for the jury to decide if they believed this had been the case of Grimes acting in self-defence and that she had not meant for Ann Manson to die. The jury, without retiring and with only a few moments of discussion, returned a verdict of guilty of manslaughter against Anne Grimes. The judge, speaking to Anne Grimes, said it was known to him that she had been imprisoned previously for drunkenness and at least once for violence, and it was for him to show others that this kind of behaviour would not be tolerated and would be punished with imprisonment, with hard labour. He then sentenced Anne Grimes to 5 years penal servitude. He hoped that during her time in prison she would be weaned off the drink and be released as a sober person. Anne would later be sent to Millbank Prison, and from there she was transferred to Woking Female Prison. It seems she was very well behaved during her first 2 years, and this would lead to her being released on licence to the East End Refuge in Finchley in 1883, and completely released by February of 1884. I did not find any further details of her after this date, and I also did not find any details of David Anderson after he was found not guilty of the crime and released in 1880. This was an incredibly sad case. Once again, it seems that drink and jealousy caused an argument that resulted in the tragic loss of life of Ann Manson. Ann Manson did not seem to want Ann Grimes to live in her home, but the latter did not seem to want to leave. Whether the argument was all down to Ann Grimes is hard to tell, and although David said he did not return to the home until 10 p.m, a witness suggested he returned much earlier. So how much did he truly know of what went on that night, and how much was he involved? He certainly did not tell anyone what he knew, and I agree with the judge. I think he knew much more than he said. I am not sure that I agree with him being found not guilty, but I do, however, agree this was a case of manslaughter and not murder. I truly believe that Ann Grimes was guilty of the crime. She was known to drink a lot and known to be violent, and I think she lashed out in anger. I don't, however, believe that 5 years in prison was enough punishment for taking the life of another person, and to then be released on licence just 3 years later, and then completely free well before she had served a full 4 years, does not seem like justice to me. But what do you think? Do you think David Anderson was more involved than he let on? Do you think Ann Manson struck the first blow and Ann Grimes acted in self-defence? Or do you think Ann Grimes was simply just a violent drunk who struck out in anger and killed the woman who had taken her in when she clearly had nowhere else to go? Do let me know your thoughts in the comments below. I do hope that you have found this sad and tragic story interesting, and I do thank you all very much for watching, and I do hope to see you all again very soon.